Well, I guess the third time's a charm. I finally did it the right way. I'm talking about the fretboard dots or the markers on this guitar, but there is a bit of a backstory that you need to hear first. I've actually made 2 other videos specifically about the fretboard dots on this guitar, and obviously, as you can probably already tell, those fixes didn't last. Now, I know what you're asking, why do you care so much, and why didn't you just buy the guitar with the right dots in the first place? Well, we'll get to that, but first I need to tell you about the guitar. So I did an entire playlist of over 30 videos on this guitar alone. It's a parts caster and I put it together myself. I say put together because I have great respect for those people who carve out, shape, and route guitar bodies and necks. That's what I think of when I think of building a guitar. In my case, I bought an unfinished neck and body and I painted them or applied color and clear coats. Now what I did do that I feel was unique was relic the guitar. At the time, a few years ago, there weren't really many videos at all about how to relic a guitar. Of course, they were gaining popularity and the Fender Custom Shop was nailing it, but for the DIYers out there just wasn't a lot of info. So I basically learned as I went and documented my successes and failures. And overall, I think it turned out great. It was my first time doing anything like that and I'm really proud of it. However, the one thing I wasn't really satisfied with was the dots. So I bought the neck from Musicraft, and when I was ordering it, the options for dots were like plain white or cream, or maybe perloid, and then there was like imitation clay or real aged clay. Now the real aged clay was maybe $40, and I thought, nah, I don't need to spend the money on that. I'm sure the dots will age over time a bit, or if nothing else, I could always make them look aged myself. Boy was I wrong, and I wish I would have just spent the extra $40. Okay, so in the first video, my first attempt at coloring the dots, I used RIT Dye-More synthetic dye, which is supposed to be able to dye plastics. However, you really need to submerge the plastic in boiling water, so needless to say, I couldn't really do that with my guitar neck, and it didn't really work. Then I tried to use a combination of OD clear cleaner for PVC and the RIT dye. The idea is that the OD stuff would kind of melt the top layer of plastic, and when it dried, it would retain the color. Now I thought this worked, but over time it honestly didn't stick and the color came off. In the second video, my main goal was to darken the fretboard itself with leather dye, and that did work, but as a sort of secondary effect or bonus, I was trying to darken the dots as well. Again, I thought this worked, but once more over time, I found that the color did not stay. So with much reluctance, I decided that I had to do it the right way and replace all of the dots. So before I started, I had to figure out what material I wanted to use for the dots. I considered buying pre-made dots from someplace, but my fear was that I wouldn't be able to find the exact color I wanted, and then it would just be a total gamble. So then I explored making my own dots. There were basically 3 options if I went this route. The first was essentially forming my own clay dots using something like Fimo clay. However, this would have required some type of metal mold like out of aluminum for the dots, both top and side dots, and baking them so that they would harden. Now I personally didn't really have the tools for this, and I didn't feel like investing in them or experimenting really with this method. The second option was using something simple like wood filler. I had seen Dave Simpson do this on his ST62 Strat. If you don't know who he is, I'll put a link to some of those videos in the description below. And it looked really great when he first did it, but then I saw some of his later videos featuring the guitar, and truthfully it looked like the dots had really soaked up dirt or finger oil or something, and the dots just looked too dark and dingy to me. The third option involved this stuff called Durham's Rock Hard Water Putty. It's made for repairs to wood, plaster, tile, etc., but I had seen it mentioned in several guitar forums as a viable option for vintage clay dots. So I bought some, it was only like $10, and I experimented a bit with it. Now to me the color seemed a bit too light and cream colored to be what I wanted, so then I thought maybe I could make my own kind of color recipe. At first I tried some Minwax wood dye and it did darken the putty, but then it looked too gray. I started brainstorming what else I could use, and I thought of food coloring. So at this point I started reading up on color combinations, you know, like yellow and blue make green kind of thing, and becoming like a mad scientist in my little lab with all these experiments. Now sometimes I would stumble upon a color that I kind of liked, but I also came up with some pretty ugly stuff like snot green. Well, the big problem with this method is that Durham's putty dries really fast, like in 10 minutes, at least in small amounts like I would be using. Plus I had to get the exact proportions of putty to water to color, and it was going to be really difficult to be accurate with the food coloring. So what that meant is that I would have to set everything up, get the putty color and consistency perfect, and apply all the dots within like 10 minutes. Essentially there would be no room for error, and that just wasn't going to cut it. Now, as sort of a sub-third option, I even toyed around with trying to color the putty and the wood filler after they had dried. I wanted to know if I could alter the color and also if anything would darken them inadvertently over time, like fretboard conditioner or cleaner. But in the end, I wasn't confident in any of my experiments, and needless to say, I abandoned all of my making my own dots options. Okay, by now you probably guessed that I decided to buy my own pre-made dots. And to find those, I did what anyone would do, and I just Googled it. Well, it turns out that between Reverb.com, eBay, luthier suppliers like StewMac, and even neck builders like the aforementioned Musicraft, there are a fair amount of options out there. But with those, of course, as I mentioned earlier, I felt like I had to take a leap of faith on the color. Essentially, I would be guessing from the less than detailed images that I saw on my computer screen. And of course, since I had put this much effort into it already, I wanted to make sure I got it right. So the way I ended up settling on the right dots was sort of a happy accident. I recently put some Lambertone's Blondies pickups in one of my Telestyle guitars, link is above, and in researching those pickups, I came across a guy named Zach Bropst, if I'm saying that right, who had demoed those pickups. Well, I love the look of the dots on the guitar he was using, and it turns out that the neck and of course the dots had come from a place called Parklane Guitars out of New Jersey. So I went to the Parklane site and they didn't have an outright way to purchase their clay dots. But I found out that if I went through the motions of building a neck but not actually selecting anything, I could put only the dots in my cart and even check out. So I did that, not really knowing what to expect. But as you would expect, because it wasn't a normal order, I didn't get much by way of an invoice or receipt or shipping details. So a couple of days went by and I thought maybe I should try to reach out to see if the order was actually going to be fulfilled. I ended up calling Parklane and Steve, the owner, answered the phone. He was super nice and helpful. He was actually in the middle of putting my order together, and he said, yeah, we typically don't do this sort of thing, but I went ahead and put them together for you. And by the way, they were packaged really well when they arrived. But yeah, on the phone, he was giving me installation tips and everything, asking me what my project was, what I was building. And interestingly enough, he used to work at Musicraft, and putting two and two together, he said he probably fretted the very neck I would be installing these on. Pretty cool and kind of fitting. Okay, I know that was a lot of backstory, so now let's finally get on to the installation. Once the dots arrived, it hit me that, okay, I'm really gonna have to do this. Now I had some basic understanding of how I was gonna go about it, and I had already gathered a couple of reference YouTube videos for guidance. Almost all of them centered around the concept that you would drill a hole into the dots, or perhaps use a screw, and then pull them out. And pretty much all of them made it look really easy. Simple, right? Well, it did not go so easily for me. I mean, right off the bat, my drill slipped as I was trying to make the starting divot. Maybe that was a sign of things to come. I ended up also using a razor blade to deepen the mark. And I did manage to drill into the first dot just fine. I used the opposite end of the drill bit to try and pry the plastic out as I had seen others do, apparently so easily. But as I discovered, my dots did not want to come out. As a matter of fact, I slowly learned that it wanted to pull up the surrounding fretboard wood, and that gave me a huge sinking feeling. So I did my best to try and remove the rest of the dot using a small screwdriver and a razor blade. I used some painter's tape in hopes of keeping the wood intact. Who knows if that really did any good. On the next dot, I had the idea of using a brad point drill bit. It definitely seemed to help with making a better starting dimple. As far as drilling, it was basically no different. And in the same vein, the dot once again didn't want to come out. Whatever material Musicraft had used was just very hard and brittle, not soft and malleable like other examples I had seen. So at that point, I had the thought that maybe I could melt the dots. Thus, on the next one, I still drilled a hole, but I got out my soldering iron to see if it would do the trick. It wasn't going well at first, but I think that was because I hadn't given it time to fully heat up. Once it was hot enough, it seemed to work much better than the other method. I still had to use my small screwdriver to chip away the plastic and to be cautious about removing any surrounding wood. But overall, I ended up using that method on the rest of the dots. Okay, so then it was on to fitting the new dots into the holes. But before we get to that, here are a few quick photos showing a comparison of the color of the old dots versus the new ones. You can see that the old dots were really yellowish in color from me trying to darken them. And then in contrast, you can see the beautiful tan, slightly pink color of the new dots. I didn't know how smoothly the new dots would go in, and it turned out that they were a tight fit. I got a small piece of wood and tried to just press one in, but it wasn't going to work. I was curious to see how deep the holes were in comparison to the height of the dots, so I got my calipers out to measure. Then I ended up using my razor blade to clean up a few small remains of plastic that I saw. I followed that up with taking a drill bit by hand and carefully working it back and forth in the hole. All that seemed to work pretty nicely. Then I put a few drops of super glue in the holes and proceeded to push them in. I used a small piece of wood again and a hammer to give it some force. And thankfully that too seemed to go well, minus some stray super glue on the fretboard. That said, the dots still didn't seem to go in very far, so I had to figure out the best way to sand them down. I put some painter's tape down to protect the fretboard, and then I got out a small metal file. This seemed to do the trick, but it gunked up extremely quickly and I found it hard to clean off the file. However, despite this, I still found it to be the best method. Even with the filing, I knew I would have to follow it up with sandpaper. I used 400 grit at first and then followed it up with 800 using painter's tape as long as I could. I didn't want to scratch up the fretboard, but it just seemed inevitable. Speaking of which, to truly get rid of the scratches the right way, I would need to evenly sand the entire fretboard. However, as I stated previously, the dark color of my fretboard is really due to the leather dye that I had used, and I didn't want to strip all that color off. That, combined with the fact that I got kind of lazy, resulted in me actually taking a brown Sharpie, believe it or not, to the scratched parts of the wood. And surprisingly, it had a good result, at least from far away. Then I thought I'd try a little fretboard conditioner, all in the hopes of sort of camouflaging the scratches, but of course, as I kind of expected, it didn't really work. I guess I was just hoping for a shortcut, however I did find a better way, which I'll discuss later. Once I added the fretboard oil to kind of mask the scratches, I got a temporary idea of what the finished product would look like, and I was super happy with it. Now I was hoping not to have to replace the side dots at all. I was thinking maybe that the colors of the top and side dots would be similar enough and the distance between them would distract. But I realized that they were just too dissimilar and I wasn't going to be happy unless I replaced the side dots as well. Now given the trouble I had with the top dots and the more delicate and fragile nature of the side dots, I was feeling a lot of anxiety about trying to attempt it. However, this is where I feel like I kind of hit my stride. I made a little jig with some 2x4s and zip ties to hold the neck in place. I got the idea from Green River Gear Reviews, and I'll try to put a link to that channel below. I was afraid the wood might scratch the neck if it moved or vibrated at all, but it wasn't a problem. As far as the process of installing the side dots, I found a video from Ben at Crimson Guitars that was a big help. He was actually working on a jazz bass, but the principles are still the same. His formula started off with a center punch to make a good starting point. Since my attempts at doing this on the top dots didn't go smoothly, I thought maybe I should get a proper center punch. So I went down to my local Harbor Freight and got an inexpensive one. The only problem is that it had a push to strike action that really packed a punch. I tested it out on some scrap wood and seeing what it did, I was afraid it would damage my neck. So I ended up using it, but just pressing down enough to make a mark without it forcefully striking down. The next part of Ben's method required the use of some small drill bits, which I also did not have. So again, I picked some up at Harbor Freight. And wow, I had no idea how tiny these things actually were. I can't even believe they can machine something that small. Anyway, the first bit needed was a 1mm diameter. Well, I found out quickly that my drill chuck wouldn't even clamp down onto it, it would just fall right out. So after getting a little pissed off, wouldn't you know that I came across a YouTube video that solved my problem. Thanks to 65 Ford, again I'll try to put a link below, I was able to take some wire and twist it around the drill bit so that it would fit into the chuck. I actually ended up using the wire from a twist tie. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Once I got that sorted, I used Ben's prescription to drill a hole first with the 1mm bit, and then moving on to a 1.5mm and finally to a 2mm bit. When you get to the 2mm bit, the trick is to start with the drill in reverse, just to minimize any damage, and then follow with the forward direction. All this, believe it or not, went surprisingly well. Not that I didn't trust the method, it's just that I thought somehow I would screw it up. Speaking of screwing up, I then put the first side dot in. Now Ben used super glue with a very tiny applicator, or a whip tip as apparently it's called. I didn't have anything like that and I didn't want to deal with the mess if it squirted out everywhere. So I decided to just use wood glue. I've seen the famous luthier Dan Erlewine do this, so I knew it was a legit option. Now that actually wasn't the part where I screwed up. I used a dab of wood glue on the end of a toothpick and got the dot in just fine by tapping on it a bit with the end of a screwdriver. But instead of sanding it down, I thought it would save time by lopping it off with a razor blade. Well, I don't know if it was bad luck or just bad technique, but I managed to chip off part of the dot that was below the surface. So then I had to drill it out all over again with the whole shebang, center punch, and then stepping up drill bit sizes. But this time I did it the tried and true way of sanding it down. However, instead of using the file, I used coarse 150 grit sandpaper. Now I'm not going to show you every dot, but I did learn that I should be liberal with the painter's tape because the sandpaper could easily sand unwanted places on either side of the dot. By the time I got to the end of the neck, I was getting pretty efficient. Now since my guitar is relic, not every dot was surrounded by clear coat, in my case nitrocellulose. But at the end of the neck there was nitro along the edge of the fretboard. So once I got the dot sanded down with coarse sandpaper, I taped up the maple side of the neck and used much finer 800 grit sandpaper to level out the dots. I followed that up with 1000 grit and then 1500 grit to polish it off as much as I could. Now then, back to the top of the fretboard. I needed to remove some of the super glue that got away from me. I've always understood that acetone will remove superglue, so I got some of my wife's nail polish remover and applied it. It should be noted here that the acetone will also eat away nitro, so if you use it, you gotta be careful. Anyway, the nail polish remover didn't seem to work for some reason. Maybe I didn't leave it on long enough or something, but in the end I just sanded away the residual glue. Okay, so you know how I mentioned earlier that I had to find a way to add the color back to the fretboard? Well, I discovered that I actually had some Feebings leather dye left over from the first time I darkened the fretboard, even though it had somehow spilled out all over the box and made a mess. Anyway, I put some on a Q-tip, not the big applicator that comes with the dye, and ever so carefully worked my way around each dot, being sure not to get the color on the dot itself. And this is kind of where my journey ended. I was happy enough with the way the dye turned out, especially after adding some more fretboard conditioner, that I stopped there. Again, the ideal or the correct way to do it would have been to sand down the entire fretboard, but I had gone through enough trauma through the whole ordeal that I decided just to say heck with it. Maybe one day I'll do it, but honestly it's not bad at all and I'm not too worried about it. I'm truly happy with the end result, and even though it was a challenge, I'm glad I did it. And that's it. I know that was a lot of detail for a seemingly simple project, but honestly this has taken me a couple years to get right, believe it or not. I want to say sincerely thank you for watching my video or any of my videos. People say that all the time on YouTube, but the market has been sort of saturated. There's a lot of channels, a lot of videos out there, so you have to be selective in what you watch. So again, a heartfelt, sincere thank you for taking time to watch any of my stuff. I really appreciate it. We'll see you next time.